there's some incredibly inspired stuff going on, but people in the next town don't know about it.
No.
There's been a real communication challenge, and I get asked all the time about, why do you think it's a good idea for us open a recovery cafe? And you're going to go, no, try and do something different and imaginative and creative. So one of the things we're talking about in Newcastle at the moment is opening a sports bar. And the idea is everybody in Newcastle loves the football, but in your recovery, go and watch it. Well, wouldn't it be brilliant to have a sober sports bar where you could only get alcohol-free beer?
I think these things are so important. The recent recovery group in Rotherham, they do snooker, and it makes sense because snooker's a really big thing in Rotherham and Sheffield. And as you know, we do mountains because we live in the mountains. And I met with a group of people just not very long ago in Donegal in south of Ireland that wanted to start a recovery group, and they're sandwiched between a boxing recovery group and a physical exercise group, and there are a bunch of people who are not interested in any of that, and they're trying to find their way of doing their own thing. And as you rightly say, you can't copy next door. If it doesn't suit you and it doesn't fit, then it's not going to work, is it?
And for me as a researcher, I guess for you as well, Wulf, there's a real challenge about the science of recovery doesn't include the same principle of replication that if you were designing a detox, because it's too reliant on social networks, context, assets, resources. And so there is that big challenge that just because something works in Wrexham doesn't mean it's going to work in Colwyn Bay.
Absolutely.
And I think for me, the idea of how you unpick the specificity from the generalizable principle is something we're nowhere near answering. So anyway, back to that time, there was, and there was also a guy in Glasgow who, I don't know if you remember, there was a famous BBC dramatization called David Bryce, who ran Calton Athletic, effectively a 12-step inspired football team. That I think Robbie Coltrane and Lenny Henry were in the film version of it, and there were all these things going on, but they weren't well coordinated. And something that sadly still happens, there was a kind of sneering from addiction science about this is all about God and wishful thinking, and if recovery happens, it's a rare thing and it's nothing worth studying. And anyway, the pharmaceutical companies aren't interested, so why would we care? So, there's a real a frustration for me has been, my main area of work is around recovery capital.
Yes.
There's not really globally, there's probably about half a dozen people do anything on that. It's really not been picked up by academics, and certainly not by academics in the UK or Europe, where there remains a real skepticism, partly because of the lack of money. But for me, that time, going back to that time, there was a genuine sense of opportunity and possibility. There was a 2007 Road to Recovery policy in Scotland, which also fitted in at a time where Scotland was, with a new parliament, there was a genuine air of hope and excitement. The new strategy brought the SDRC to life, the Scottish Drugs Recovery Consortium, and that acted as a catalyst for a lot of activity. Not all of it successful, but it acted as a catalyst for a lot of activity, which was really exciting. In England, it was a much more complicated position because also we were then switching to the post-NTA world with the advent of the large charities and the decommissioning of lots of services, loss of funding, all of the kind of austerity miseries. But nonetheless, there has continued to be a significant growth in the recovery world over that decade or so.
Yeah, and of course in the UK, if you think about that period then, it did feel like it was kind of UK activity, but what you've described is probably very accurate, really. Quite quickly, it might be fair to say only Scotland really had anything that might feel like an attempt at any national recovery footprint through either a policy or organisations like, and In Wales, you'll well know there were only two pockets, really, to be honest. There was the pocket that I'm involved in the northwest, and then the one that Sarah Vale was involved in down in Cardiff. That was it for Wales. It wasn't particularly coming from the government and anything like that. And then, right, you say in England, it was just, well, and probably remains today, fragmented chaos is a nice description, probably.
And for me, like the English system remains all show and no action around recovery. And I think one of the more insidious things that has happened is that really, and I guess it's called funding candy, commissioning candy, that services now call themselves treatment and recovery services. And basically they employ or have as volunteers a couple of people in early recovery who they send out to tick those boxes. And
aren't they really dangerous comedians, though? Because and this is not to denigrate the individuals within, but when organisations will just continue to change their name to sweep up anything, and they, whatever they're called now, We Are With You or Change, Grow, Live. You might as well call your organisation at that point in time anything you care to fund us for. I'm being a bit cynical, but...
Oh, yeah. And it's like, when I worked in Australia, in the mental health recovery movement, they had a great term, which is spray on recovery. And basically...
Okay, that's a good one. I like that. Yeah, that's a nice term. Yeah.
The mental health worker, their door on the door, it now says recovery worker. On all the marketing materials, it says recovery service. Nothing else has changed. Yeah. And it feels like it's not only that, which would be cynical. There's an extra level of cynicism about a few people are appointed who are dangerously isolated, unsupported, who are doing that token effort. And you're absolutely right to say it is not the flaw or the fault of a number of individuals. And in spite of that, there are still areas where all of those big services do some really innovative...
Yeah, even they do magic. Yes, no, in their local areas, they do magic as well. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's still that astonishing postcode lottery. And I since the first Dame Carol Black review, and we've now had it numerous times, I got really optimistic and excited in England when the 2010 drug strategy came out, which made recovery very clear, talking about recovery champions, all that kind of stuff. And it feels to me every English policy since then somehow gets diluted down by the draft stage. So by the time it gets to implementation, it might as well just say business as usual. And it feels to me like there's a whole series of people who have been apologists for essentially the maintenance of the status quo, including my former employers at the National Addiction Centre.